I inherited a coastal cabin from my husband, Renita Cross, and my son, Kellen, received a luxury townhouse in Charleston. Right there in the living room of the house in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I had lived for 37 years, Kellen flipped through the will as if he were counting winning lottery tickets. When he reached the assets section, his face twisted with contempt. "A coastal cabin?" He laughed. "Mom gets a rotten shack by the ocean, and I get a townhouse in Charleston. Perfect. Even in death, Dad still knew who deserved what." I didn't argue. What was the point of arguing when Vernon had already chosen, and clearly in his final calculation I wasn't worth much? Our family attorney, Camille Roebuck, cleared her throat softly, trying to stay professional in an atmosphere stretched tight like a wire. "Mr. Cross left very specific instructions," Camille said. "The cabin is fully paid off, Renita. No mortgage, no debt." Kellen let out a snort. "Great. Mom can live with rats and seagulls. I'm sure she'll love the smell of low tide." Camille slid a set of keys across the table. 308 Sandpiper Lane, Nag's Head, the Outer Banks. The cabin hasn't been occupied for a while. "Hasn't been occupied," Kellen mimicked. "Just say abandoned." I stuffed the keys into my pocket. The metal was icy against my fingertips, cold the way my life had just been snapped into a different shape. Kellen gathered the papers into his leather briefcase like stuffing in trophies. He stood, then paused at the doorway with that familiar, challenging look he'd had since childhood. "You should pack," he said. "I'm listing the house next week." I shot to my feet. "This is my home too, Kellen." "Not anymore." He smiled, sharp as a blade. "Dad left it to me, along with everything that matters. You have 48 hours. The door slammed, and the house instantly felt huge, then terrifyingly empty, as if every bit of warmth had been drained out in seconds. Camille collected her files, avoiding my eyes. "Mrs. Cross, if you need legal support, I understand," I said. And I understood very well. My husband had been dead only 6 months, and my son was throwing me out like trash. That night, I sat among boxes in the living room. The next morning, the movers arrived at exactly 8. They hauled away the fine china, the antique furniture Vernon's mother had left behind, even the family photos. I picked up our wedding picture that had fallen out of a box. Vernon in a rented suit, me in a white dress, both of us smiling like we'd just hit the jackpot. When did everything change? When did I become someone who could be discarded so easily? My phone buzzed. A text from Kellen. "Movers at 8 a.m. Don't get in the way." I turned the phone off, and that night I slept in my home for the last time. The next afternoon, I loaded my pickup with the things that truly belonged to me. Clothes, a few books, a few tools. I sat for a long time at the end of the driveway, engine still running, staring at the rose bushes Vernon had planted that were starting to bloom. I'd fertilized them the week before, like every spring for 15 years. Now someone else would enjoy them. The drive to Nag's Head took 2 hours. I had never been to the Outer Banks, didn't even know Vernon owned property here. How long had he hidden this? And if the cabin was as worthless as Kellen claimed, why had Vernon kept it? Sandpiper Lane was a narrow, sandy road that ran straight and then dead-ended at the beach. The houses on either side were oddly mixed, some old and hunched like the elderly, some new and glossy like resorts. Number 308 definitely belonged to the forgotten group. The cabin looked like it had lost a war to salt air, peeling blue paint, a sagging porch, boarded up windows. I sat in the truck for a few seconds, my heart heavy. But something nagged at me. Vernon could be cold, could be distant, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't keep something worthless for years without a reason. I carried my toolbox up onto the porch. The old key turned smoothly in the lock, too smoothly for a door that was abandoned. The door opened, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the smell of mildew. It was lavender. Inside was old but clean. A sofa with a blanket neatly folded. On the table, fresh flowers that were wilted but not dead. In the kitchen, a drying rack. 2 plates, 2 mugs. In the fridge, milk expired 3 days ago. On the top shelf, medications lined up in perfect rows. The name on the prescription label made my hands go cold. Sade Whitfield. On the side table were medical letters addressed to Sade Whitfield at this exact address. Mixed among them, they were envelopes addressed to Vernon Cross. Trembling, I picked one up. A letter from Vernon's oncology doctor scheduling a consultation 2 months before he died, an appointment he had never told me about. I collapsed onto the sofa, my mind spun. Vernon had been here. He had been receiving medical treatment in secret. And he had shared this space with a woman named Sade Whitfield. On the coffee table was a photo album. I opened it. The first page stole my breath. Vernon in the photo was smiling. Not the polite smile, not the tired-at-home smile, but a real one, the kind I hadn't seen on him in years. He sat on the beach in front of the cabin, his arm around a young woman with black hair and gentle eyes. I flipped faster. Vernon and her cooking, walking, reading on the porch. Vernon looked so peaceful it hurt. There were also photos of just Sade, around 30, moving carefully. In one, she used a walker. In another, she sat in a wheelchair. Behind her, medical equipment was visible. My throat tightened. Vernon had been taking care of her. But why hide it from me? Just then, I heard footsteps on the porch. The doorknob turned slowly. A key slid into the lock from the outside. The door opened. And the woman from the album walked in, smaller than in the pictures, moving on forearm crutches, hair tied back, wearing scrubs like she'd just come from the hospital. She was still setting down her bags when she called softly, "Vernon, I bought the cookies you wanted. The doctor said your appetite could—" She froze when she saw me. We stared at each other for seconds that felt endless. Then she said very calmly, as if she'd been preparing for this moment for a long time, "You're Renita." Not a question. I nodded, my throat burning dry. How did she know me? Sade set her bag down, sat across from me, and placed her crutches within reach. Vernon said, "You might come here one day." She looked at me with an oddly gentle gaze. "He talked about you all the time." "He loved you very much. You know that, don't you?" If you're wondering who Sade Whitfield is in Vernon's life and why a cabin that was abandoned smelled like lavender, had 2 sets of dishes, and even had cancer paperwork I'd never known about, don't go anywhere. Because what Sade said next was the moment my limbs went ice cold, and I realized I hadn't just lost my husband. I was about to face a truth that had been buried for decades. It took me a few seconds to find my voice again. My throat was burning dry, my heart pounding like it wanted to leap out of my chest. I don't understand," I said, each word dragged up from the bottom of my lungs. "Who are you? Why are you living with my husband?" Sade looked at me for a long moment, then gave a faint, sorrowful smile. There was no triumph in it. It looked like the exhaustion of someone who had carried a secret for too long. "I don't live with him," she said softly. "He came to visit me. This is my home, Renita. Vernon bought it for me 3 years ago." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I felt like the floor under me wasn't solid anymore. "That's impossible," I blurted. We never had that kind of money." Sade nodded, her eyes both gentle and steady, as if she'd expected this reaction for a long time. "He used the inheritance from his mother," she said. "The money he told you he donated to charity." My mouth opened, but no sound came out. In my head, broken fragments of memory began snapping into place. The vague conversations, Vernon's silences, the expenses he explained away. All of it suddenly took on a terrifying shape. "He wanted you to know the truth. At the end," Sade continued, her voice still slow. "But he was afraid." "Afraid of what?" I heard my voice trembling. Sade reached for a manila envelope sitting on the side table. Her movement was careful, as if her body wouldn't let her rush. She lifted it, then hesitated. I watched her chest rise, like she needed a deep breath for what she was about to say. "Afraid of how you'd react when you found out She paused, then said it clearly, painfully, like a cut. "When you found out I'm his daughter." Those words hit me like a physical punch. I gripped the sofa armrest, my nails biting into the wood, the world suddenly tipping hard to one side. "No," I choked out. "Vernon never had a child before Kellen." "Yes," Sade said. "He did." She opened the envelope, pulled out a sheet of paper, and held it out to me. A birth certificate. "He had me when he was 18, Sade said slowly. "He gave me up for adoption because his family threatened to disown him if he kept me." I stared at the paper like it belonged to some life that wasn't real. Sade Whitfield, born as Sade Vernon Holloway, mother Angela Holloway, father Vernon Isaiah Cross. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. Vernon had a daughter he gave up, then found again. A daughter he hid from me for 3 years while he was dying. Why? My voice broke, so weak it was barely breath. Why didn't he tell me? Sade's expression grew even sadder, as if that question was the very thing that had worn her down every day. "Because of Kellen," she answered. "He was afraid he would make things hard for me." She hesitated, then continued more slowly. "And because he was ashamed. Ashamed he gave me up. Ashamed he lied to you about the money. Ashamed he kept too many secrets." Sade looked straight at me. Her voice wasn't accusing, but every word carried weight. "He said you were a good person," she said. "You deserved better than a husband who lived an entire marriage with too many lies." I looked around the cabin again, and everything suddenly changed color in my eyes. This wasn't Vernon's secret hideout. This was where he came to be a father to the daughter he had lost, to make up for 37 years of absence in whatever time he had left. And he died, without ever telling me the truth. I swallowed hard. My throat felt gritty, like it was full of sand. Sade studied my face carefully, as if she was afraid I might shatter right there. "He left something for you," she said. "He made me promise. If you came here, I'd give it to you." Then she reached behind the sofa and pulled out a wooden box. I recognized it immediately. The box I had made in shop class in high school. I had given it to Vernon when we first started dating, and I hadn't seen it in years. I used to think he'd thrown it away long ago. "He kept it all these years," Sade said softly. "He said it was the most precious thing he owned because you made it for him when you still believed in forever." I opened the lid. Inside were letters. Dozens of letters, all addressed to me in Vernon's careful handwriting. The top letter was dated just 2 weeks before he died. My hand shook so badly the paper rustled like wind. I opened it and began to read. "My beloved Renita, if you're reading this, it means you've met Sade and you know the truth. I was too cowardly to say while I was alive. I have so much to explain, so much to apologize for. But first, you need to know about Kellen." I looked up at Sade. In that moment, I saw the thing that hurts people the most. Her eyes. Eyes that looked frighteningly like Vernon's. And I wondered why I hadn't noticed the instant she walked in. "About Kellen, what?" I asked, my voice gone hoarse. "Keep reading," Sade said, gentle but firm. "He wanted you to know everything." I lowered my gaze back to the letter, and Vernon's words began to pull my entire life into another storm. Kellen was in serious financial trouble, though he didn't yet understand the full extent. 3 months earlier, he borrowed a large sum by mortgaging the townhouse in Charleston, using forged documents to make it look like Vernon had co-signed. He owed $850,000 to a private lending company, and the payment came due last week. My stomach clenched. $850,000. I read the number again, like an idiot hoping I'd misread it, but Vernon's handwriting was clear and precise. There was no room for mistake. The townhouse wasn't worth enough to cover that debt, and when the lenders discovered the fraud, Kellen would face criminal charges. Vernon found out when the bank called him directly to verify the loan. That was when he hired a private investigator to dig deeper. I set the letter down for a moment. My mind reeled. Kellen, mitanin, the son who had just thrown me out, was a fraud. And Vernon had known before he died. Sadie spoke at just the right moment, her voice small but pulling me back from the edge. "There's more," she said, "about the medical treatments." I picked the letter back up, my palms ice cold. Vernon wrote that he came to the cabin not only to spend time with Sade, but also because he was receiving experimental cancer treatment at a medical center here, Clearwater Medical. The cancer had returned 2 years ago, more aggressive than before. He didn't tell me because he couldn't bear watching me go through that pain again. The first cancer battle had nearly killed both of us. He couldn't make me watch him fade a second time. Tears blurred my vision. Vernon had fought cancer alone. While I thought he was getting better, while I believed the checkups were just routine, while I reassured myself that it was all behind us, it turned out he was dying, facing it in silence. Sade spoke softly, as if afraid to break me. He didn't want you to see him suffering. He said you'd been through enough the first time, and he couldn't make you watch him fade again. I remembered Vernon's first cancer battle 15 years ago, the chemotherapy days when he was so weak he could barely take a few steps without gasping, the way he lost his hair, the nights I held him when he cried from pain and fear. It was the hardest thing we had ever faced. But we faced it together. "He should have told me," I whispered, more to myself than to Sade. Sade lowered her eyes, then looked back up at me. He wanted to. Every day he wanted to. But Kellen kept demanding more and more of his attention, and he was so tired, Renita. She inhaled, her voice slowing. He said it was easier to come here, where he could rest, spend time with me, without having to pretend to be strong. I kept reading, even though every line felt like it was pulling me deeper under. Sade has a degenerative muscular condition that requires ongoing medical care. Insurance doesn't cover everything she needs, and she can't work full-time because of it. Vernon helped with her medical expenses and arranged for Saad to receive a significant inheritance when he died. My throat tightened. While Kellen was taking from us, Vernon was quietly caring for the daughter he had never stopped loving. I looked at Sade. This time, I really looked. I saw how carefully she held her body. I saw the slight tremors in her hands. At first I'd assumed it was nerves, but now I understood it was a long war. "What kind of condition?" I asked. "Muscular dystrophy," Sade answered. "Progressive. I was diagnosed at 25. My adoptive parents helped at first, but they died in a car accident 5 years ago. Since then I've been alone." She paused, her gaze dipping. Vernon found me right when I was about to lose my apartment. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. Vernon had saved his daughter's life, while our son was destroying his own with greed and fraud. My husband had quietly become a hero, in a way no one knew. I kept reading. "Renita, I need you to know that every penny I spent on Sade came from my mother's inheritance. That money was mine to use as I chose. I never touched our joint account or your retirement savings, but Kellen did. The private investigator found evidence that he had forged my signature on withdrawal slips for months. My hands curled into fists without me realizing. "How much?" I heard myself ask, my voice thick and raw. Saad reached for another folder and set it in front of me. $43,000 from your retirement account, she said. $27,000 from your savings. He took it in small amounts, probably hoping you wouldn't notice. $70,000. Money I had saved for decades. Money I depended on for survival when I could no longer work. Kellen took it all, while looking me in the eye and still calling me a failure. Sade added gently, but without dodging it, "There's more in the box. Bank statements, copies of forged documents. Everything Vernon's investigator found." I pulled out the stack of papers with trembling hands, one transaction after another, all bearing my signature, but not my handwriting. Kellen had practiced my signature, and he'd done it well enough to drain my life savings without anyone questioning it. The Charleston townhouse he inherited wasn't just mortgaged. It was mortgaged to pay off gambling debts accumulated over the past 2 years, and the private lending company he owed wasn't the kind that accepted a payment plan. It was the kind that could cause serious harm. Right then, I want you to imagine this feeling with me. In just a few dozen minutes, you discover 3 truths at once. One truth would be enough to bring you to your knees, but here it's 3. 1, the person you've lived with for decades has hidden an entire second life from you. 2, the child you gave birth to has been quietly draining every dollar you saved for old age. And 3, the man you loved fought death in silence, leaving you standing here, alone, among letters like shards of glass. And do you know what the scariest part is? I still hadn't touched the final shard of glass, the one that would make everything change direction completely. I found another letter, shorter. The paper was slightly thicker, the handwriting still Vernon's, but the strokes looked more urgent, as if he was afraid he wouldn't have time. Renita, I know this is too much, but you need to understand something important. The cabin is not a worthless asset the way Kellen thinks. The entire coastal area is being rezoned for commercial development. The state is buying out all property owners to build a new marine research facility and a public park. Sade's cabin is worth about $2.7 million, and the sale is expected to close next month. I stared at the number, $2.7 million. I read it again to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Sade nodded when she saw my expression, her voice low but decisive. Vernon arranged for me to receive $1.7 million, enough to guarantee my medical care for life and more than that. She paused, then continued, like placing a stone on the table. The remaining amount, $1 million, belongs to you, along with this cabin, so you can live here until the sale closes. But why? I heard my voice break. Why didn't he tell me? Why go through all this secrecy? Sade's smile was sad, but there was something deeply proud in it, as if she were speaking about a man who chose to love through planning, not words, because he wanted to make sure Kellen couldn't manipulate you into giving him money, she said. He knew if you found out while he was still alive, you'd feel obligated to save him from his debts. She looked straight at me, each word clear. This way, the money is protected. I leaned back in the chair, overwhelmed. In one afternoon, I discovered my husband had been dying in secret. I had a stepdaughter who needed medical care. My son was a thief and a fraud, and I was about to become a millionaire. What happens now? I asked, my voice smaller. Sade reached for her crutches and stood carefully. Now we wait for Kellen to discover on his own that the townhouse can't save him, she said. Vernon's lawyer said he has about 2 weeks before the fraud catches up to him. The lending company he owes has started asking questions. And, as if our conversation had just summoned someone, my phone rang. Kellen's name appeared on the screen. I looked at Sade. She nodded encouragingly, her expression strangely calm, as if she had replayed this scene in her mind many times. Answer, Sade said softly. But don't tell him anything. Yet. Vernon wanted you to see how he reacts when he thinks you have nothing at all. I took a deep breath. My finger slid across the screen, and I picked up. The phone vibrated in my hand like a living creature. Kellen's name lit up on the screen. I glanced at Sade. She only gave a slight nod. So calm it was chilling, as if she already knew this call was inevitable, the only question being sooner or later. I swiped to answer and brought the phone to my ear. Hello, Kellen. On the other end, his voice cracked immediately. Mom, thank God. He was breathing fast, tense, panicked, nothing like the arrogant voice he used when he threw me out. I need to talk to you. There's a problem with the townhouse, some kind of paperwork issue. Can you come home?" I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch one more beat, long enough to hear the panic in his breathing. "You didn't want Mom in that house anymore," I said slowly. "Remember? You gave me 48 hours to leave." "Mom!" Kellen was almost sobbing. "Please, this is serious. I think someone is trying to steal the inheritance. I need you to help me." I met Sade's eyes. She shook her head very slightly, a reminder that didn't need words. Don't soften. Don't open the door for him again. I took a breath, kept my voice steady. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Kellen. I'm dealing with my own problems." "What problems?" Kellen shot back, his voice rising. "You have to understand this is bigger than both of us. The entire family inheritance is under threat." I curled my lip, but it wasn't a smile. It was that mix of sadness and anger you feel when someone chews on the word family, as if they ever valued it. "The family inheritance?" I repeated, each word dropping like a stone. "You mean the inheritance you said I didn't deserve?" Silence on the other end. I could picture his face, confused, angry, then instantly switching into that act he always used whenever he wanted something. "Mom, I know I said those things. But I was grieving Dad. You know I didn't mean it." I heard how slick that sentence was. Slick like oil. Slick like the way he always wriggled out of consequences. "Actually, Kellen," I said, still even, "I think you meant every single word." Then I hung up. I turned the phone off right after, like flipping an old switch that had hurt me for years. Inside the cabin, the air went quiet. I looked at Sade. She was smiling. A small, light smile, like someone watching a knot finally start to loosen the right way. And for the first time since I stepped into this cabin, I smiled too. "How long do you think it'll take?" I asked, my voice hoarse but clear, before he realizes he's in real trouble? "From what Vernon told me," Sade replied, "about 2 days. That's when the interest comes due, and the lending company stops accepting excuses." I lowered my gaze and picked up Vernon's stack of letters again. There were still dozens unopened, and I had a very clear feeling this story was far from over. But strangely, for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I opened the next letter. Vernon's familiar slanted handwriting hit my eyes, like a voice returning from memory. "My beloved Renita, I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed. But I need you to understand. I never stopped loving you. Every day, every second, my heart belonged to you. Not telling you about Saad was the biggest mistake of my life, but I was afraid you would see me differently. Afraid you would never be able to forgive me for giving up my daughter when I was young." Tears blurred my vision. I wiped them quickly and kept reading, as if I stopped, I wouldn't have the courage to go on. Vernon wrote that he was 18 when Angela became pregnant. Neither of them was ready to be a parent. Vernon's family threatened him. If he kept the baby, they would throw him out and cut off all financial support. Angela's family did the same. They threatened to disown her. So they gave Sade up for adoption, believing it was the best thing for her. But Vernon wrote that the decision haunted him every day for 37 years. I paused for a beat, and in my mind I saw Vernon at 18, young, terrified, forced, cornered into a decision that would cling to him for the rest of his life. I didn't know whether I felt compassion or anger, maybe both. Vernon wrote that he had searched for Sade for decades. He hired a private investigator for the first time 20 years ago, but the adoption records were sealed. He tried again 10 years later, but still found nothing. Then 3 years ago, the law regarding access to adoption records in North Carolina changed. Vernon hired another investigator. This time they found her. You can't imagine, Renita, what it felt like to stand at my daughter's door after 34 years. My hand shook as I pressed the doorbell. My heart pounded like it would burst. Then the door opened and I saw her face, a face like my own 34 years ago. My eyes, my smile, even the way she stood. "Are you Vernon Cross?" she asked. I could only nod. I couldn't speak. "I'm Saad," she said. I think you might be my biological father." I had to stop. Tears spilled down my cheeks. I could see that scene as clearly as a film reel. Vernon standing on a porch, finally facing the daughter he had given up, not to explain, but to carry the consequences of a lifetime. Vernon wrote that Sade invited him inside. Her apartment was small, a studio in a rough neighborhood. But what caught his attention immediately wasn't the cramped space. It was the medical equipment, a walker in the corner, medications lined up on the kitchen counter. Sade told him about muscular dystrophy. She was diagnosed at 25. Her adoptive parents helped at first, but they died in a car accident and left her alone with medical bills insurance wouldn't cover. Vernon wrote that Sade worked 3 part-time jobs, 3 jobs, while her body was slowly betraying itself. She was about to be evicted because she couldn't afford the rent. And Vernon wrote, he knew right then he had to help. It was a chance to make up for 34 years of absence, to finally become the father he should have been. My hands trembled as I read. Vernon didn't just find his daughter. He found her, right as she was standing on the edge. He used his mother's inheritance to buy this cabin, a safe place for Sade, close to a good hospital, far from painful memories. And he told me he donated the money to charity, only because he didn't dare tell the truth. Vernon wrote that he knew I would ask why he didn't tell me about Sade. The truth was, he was ashamed. Ashamed that he gave up his daughter. Ashamed that he lied to me about the money. Ashamed that he kept a huge part of his life hidden from the woman he loved most. Then Vernon wrote, there was another reason, Kellen. He saw the way Kellen looked at me. The way he treated me like a burden, like an obstacle. Vernon knew that if Kellen found out about Sade, he would see her as a threat to the inheritance. He couldn't let Kellen hurt Sade. She had already suffered enough. She deserved peace, care, and love without fear. So Vernon kept the secret. He visited her while telling me he was working. He paid her medical bills in silence. He spent the precious final hours of his life with his daughter, hours he should have spent with me, and he apologized. He apologized so much. I folded the letter. I couldn't read any more right then. My heart ached like someone was crushing it, aching for Vernon, aching for Sade, aching for all the years wasted on secrets and fear. Sade sat quietly, giving me space to breathe. When I looked up, she was watching me with eyes full of understanding. He loved you so much, she said softly. He talked about you constantly, about the way you made him laugh, about how you took care of him through the first cancer battle, about how you turned the house in Raleigh into a home. I swallowed hard, but he still kept secrets from me. Because he was afraid of losing you, Sade said. He thought if you knew the truth, you would never be able to forgive him for lying. I turned to the window. The waves hit the shore in a steady rhythm. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, beautiful in a cruel way, because I never thought my life could keep being beautiful after so many blows. I would forgive him, I whispered, if he had given me the chance. I paused, my voice catching, but he never gave me that chance. Saad was silent for a long time. Then she said, like placing a choice into my hands, he left more letters. There's one explaining everything about his plan for Kellen. She looked at me. Do you want to read it? I nodded. Sade handed me a thick envelope. Inside were legal documents, bank statements, and a longer letter heavy as an indictment. I opened it. Renita, it's time you knew the whole truth about Kellen. I've been watching him for the last 6 months, and what I discovered broke my heart. Our son, the son I raised, protected, loved, has become someone I don't recognize. He owes $850,000 to a dangerous lending company. He committed fraud by forging my signature on the mortgage documents. He stole $70,000 from your savings. But the worst, Renita, the worst is what I heard him say about you. I stopped breathing. My hand clenched the edge of the page. I knew that kind of sentence. The kind that, if you read on, there was no going back. A month before I died, I heard Kellen talking on the phone in the hospital parking lot. He didn't know I was standing near an open window. "That old woman is going to die eventually," he said. "Then I'll have everything. The house, the money, all of it. She's too weak to do anything about it." I heard our son laugh when he spoke about you that way, Renita. Laugh about the woman who gave birth to him, raised him, loved him unconditionally. That was the moment I knew I had to protect you. Not only protect you from Kellen's debts, but protect you from his cruelty. Tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink. I blinked hard, trying to keep the words from smearing, but the more I tried, the more my hands shook. Vernon wrote that because of that, he made a plan, step by step, every line in the will, every layer of protection. He left Kellen the townhouse, an asset that looked valuable but carried enormous debt. He left me the cabin, an asset that would make me rich, that would give me freedom. But most importantly, he wrote, he left me Sade, the daughter he never had a real chance to love properly, the person he hoped would become my true family. I looked up. Sade was wiping away tears. She cried silently, like someone who had been holding herself together for so long that even when she cried, she didn't dare make a sound. "Vernon wanted us to be family," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He said, after you learned the truth, you would need someone." And so would I. She took a deep breath. "We can heal together." And right then, I realized something terrifying. My life wasn't just opening up a secret. It was opening up a trap Vernon had quietly set, not out of angry revenge, but to protect me by forcing Kellen to reveal his true nature when he was most desperate. If you think Kellen would call only once and stop, you're wrong. Desperation always has a habit of coming back, and this time it came back far more violently. My phone rang again, still Kellen. This time the screen showed 10 missed calls. "It's time," Sade said calmly. "Vernon wanted you to hear him, when he's desperate, when he realizes everything is collapsing." I looked at the phone, then at Sade, my stepdaughter, Kellen's sister, a piece of family I never knew I had. I raised my hand, took a deep breath. Then I answered the call. The phone kept vibrating nonstop, as if it was afraid I might have time to think. The screen stayed lit with Kellen's name. This time, it wasn't a single isolated call anymore, but a whole relentless chain, like the pounding on a door from someone who was running for their life. I looked at Sade. She sat upright in her chair, hands neatly placed on her lap, her eyes calm but resolute. That calm steadied me. I took a deep breath and picked up. "Hello?" "Mom, finally!" Kellen's voice trembled, almost shouting. "Where have you been? I've called you 100 times." In that moment, I realized something clearly. This was no longer the arrogant son who had just thrown me out. This was a terrified person, truly terrified. I kept my voice as even as I could. "You sound worried, Kellen." "Worried?" He choked it out. "Mom, I'm being threatened. Apex Financial says I owe them almost $1 million. They said I signed the contract, but I never signed anything. Someone forged my signature." I met Sade's eyes. She nodded encouragement, as if to say, "Yes, keep going. Don't back down." I answered slowly, "What a coincidence, Kellen. It sounds exactly like someone forging Mom's signature to withdraw $70,000 from her savings account." Dead silence on the other end. A thick silence, like Kellen had just had the blanket yanked off his face. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you stealing my retirement money, about you forging my signature on withdrawal slips, about you thinking I was too stupid to notice." Kellen's voice went thin and lost. "You don't understand." I can explain. No need, Kellen." I cut in, not loud, but cold enough that no one could interrupt. Because your father already explained it. Your father hired a private investigator before he died. He knew everything, every fraudulent loan, every stolen dollar, every lie. Dad knew? His voice dropped into a whisper. That's impossible. Dad never said anything to me. Because Dad was planning Kellen. I spoke each word slowly. He spent the last months of his life making sure you couldn't destroy what was left of this family. I heard him suck in a sharp breath. Then his voice shifted into suspicion, like he was trying to grab control again. Where are you? You're at that cabin, aren't you? That broken-down cabin? I glanced around the room. Clean wooden floors, a faint lavender scent. Everything kept in order as if someone's hands had been tending it. I replied, This cabin isn't broken down, Kellen. It just looks that way from the outside. Like a lot of things, worthless. Until you know the truth. What truth? What are you talking about? Saad handed me a document. The paper had a clear title and official seal, an appraisal notice from the state. I looked at it for a second, then said straight into the phone, The truth is, this cabin is worth $3.4 million, Kellen. The state is buying up the entire area to build a marine research facility. The sale will close next month. On the other end, there was no breathing, no reaction, only emptiness, as if his brain was trying to process a number too large to understand in time. Then Kellen burst out, his voice breaking. $3 million? But Dad said exactly what he wanted you to think, I replied. Dad wanted you to think Mom had nothing. He wanted you to reveal your true nature, and you did exactly what he predicted. I paused, long enough for the words that followed to land harder. You threw your mother out of the house. My voice was colder than I even expected. You called me a failure. You said Dad left me that worthless cabin because he pitied me. Mom, I'm sorry. His voice softened instantly, frantic. I didn't mean... Yes, I said flatly. You did. Just like you meant it when you stole my retirement money. Just like you meant it when you forged Dad's signature to get a fraudulent loan. Just like you meant it when you told your friends on the phone that you wished Mom would finally die so you could have everything. I heard him gasp, like someone being choked. Dad heard that? He was barely audible. Oh my God. Mom, I was just angry then. I don't really think that. Unfortunately, Kellen, I said, still even, your mother's son has taught her not to believe his apologies anymore. Sade handed me another envelope. I opened it. Inside was evidence of Kellen's gambling debt, casino bills, loan records, even images from security cameras. I scanned it and then said, Dad also knew about your gambling problem, the $200,000 in debt, on top of what you owe Apex Financial. Dad knew you'd been deceiving Mom and Dad for 2 years. Mom? Kellen's voice truly broke. You have to help me. These people aren't joking. They said if I don't pay, they'll hurt me. And at that exact moment, for the first time throughout the conversation, I felt something like pity. Kellen was genuinely afraid. Even after everything he had done, he was still the child I gave birth to. But I remembered Vernon's letter. I remembered every line like an anchor holding me back from being pulled into the familiar manipulation again. Your father predicted you would say that, I said more gently, but not soft. Dad knew you would come to Mom begging for help, promising you would change. I will change, he almost screamed. I swear. Just help me this one time. No, Kellen, I cut him off. There is no this one time anymore. I took a breath, then continued. But your father left you a choice. I heard him stop breathing. What choice? Come to this cabin, come alone, and be ready to tell the truth about everything. If you do that, there may be a way to help you. Kellen's voice latched onto that sentence, like a dying man grabbing a plank. Are you serious? You'll help me? I will do what your father wanted me to do, I said clearly. No more, no less. I paused, then lowered my voice. But Kellen, Yes. If you lie to me one more time, if you try to manipulate me or threaten me, you'll be on your own. I will not save you. Do you understand, I heard him swallow hard. I understand. Thank you, Mom. Thank God. Thank you so much. Don't thank me, I said immediately. And Kellen, yes? Bring all the original loan documents, all of them. I hung up. After I ended the call, I realized my hands were ice cold, not from fear, but because my body understood. Tomorrow would be a real confrontation. Kellen wasn't coming to apologize. Kellen was coming because he was cornered, and someone who is cornered can do anything to escape. I looked at Sade, then out the window. It was fully dark now. The ocean outside still pounded steadily as if nothing had happened, yet inside me, everything was gathering into one massive wave. Tomorrow, when Kellen walks through that door, it won't just be his truth that gets stripped bare. My heart will be tested to its limit, too. I turned to Sade. She was still sitting there, calm as an anchor. Do you think he'll really come? Sade asked. I didn't hesitate. Oh, he'll come, I said. And when he does, he'll see just how much his father knew about him. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the sea wind moved across the porch. The sun had fully set, giving way to a sky spread with stars above the outer banks. Are you scared? Sade asked softly. To meet him? I thought about it. Afraid? No, I was past fear. What was left in me was something hard, determination. Not afraid, I said. Vernon planned for everything. Your father knew exactly what Kellen would do, what he would say. He prepared for every situation. Sade smiled. He was that smart. He spent months on this, arranging every detail, anticipating every move. And when Sade said that, something suddenly cracked open inside me, an insight that was painful but bright. He loved us, I said, almost for the first time daring to admit it out loud. Vernon loved us enough to protect us, even after he was gone. I reached for another letter in the wooden box. It was short, the handwriting shaky, like Vernon wrote it in his final days when his hand no longer obeyed him. I read aloud, slowly. Renita, if you're reading this, it means Kellen is on his way. You will feel chaos, anger, heartbreak, maybe still a little hope that our son can change. I want you to know it's okay to still love him. It's okay to want to save him. That is your mother's instinct, and it's one of the things I loved most about you. But you also have to be strong. You have to let him face the consequences. That is the only way he can change. I have arranged everything. The trust fund will pay off his debt, not because he deserves it, but because I don't want the blood of our son on someone else's hands. But he will not receive a single cent. Instead, he will receive a chance, a final chance to change. The best gambling rehabilitation program in Colorado. Therapy. A small amount of financial support if he stays clean. But if he refuses, if he chooses the old path, then you must let him go, Renita. You must let him face his choices. I know this is hard. I know your heart will break, but you have Sade now. You have a daughter who needs you, who will love you unconditionally without manipulation. Be strong, my love. Be the strong woman I have loved for 35 years. With all my love. Vernon, I folded the letter. In my chest, something hurt and warmed at the same time, like Vernon's strength passed through the paper, through time, and touched me directly. He'll come tomorrow, Sade said softly. You need rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. She was right. But for the first time since Vernon died, I didn't feel alone. I had Sade. I had Vernon's plan, and I had enough strength to do what needed to be done. Thank you, I said to Sade. For being here, for being the daughter Vernon needed. Sade smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. Thank you, she replied, her voice thick but real, for giving me the chance to become your daughter. We hugged. Two women Vernon loved, brought closer by the final plan of a man determined to protect his family, even as he lay under cold ground. And in the quiet darkness of the coastal cabin, I knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow, when Kellen walks in here, everything will be different. Kellen arrived at sunset the next day. His glossy BMW looked out of place on the bumpy, sandy road of Sandpiper Lane, like something luxurious dropped into the wrong setting. I stood in the kitchen, watching through the narrow gap in the window curtain. Kellen sat in the car for a long time, not getting out right away. Maybe he was trying to steady himself, or arranging a new story that would sound the most reasonable. Sade had retreated into the bedroom to give me privacy. But I knew she was still there, still listening, because this conversation wouldn't only decide my fate, it would also affect her future. When the knocking sounded, I didn't open the door immediately. I left Kellen standing out there for a few more beats. I remembered Vernon's instruction in one of his letters. Make him wait. Let it sink in that this time he no longer has the right to give orders. Finally, I opened the door. Kellen stood in front of me, looking like he'd been dragged through a long, sleepless night. The hair he always kept perfectly styled was now a mess. His expensive dress shirt was wrinkled. The dark circles under his eyes made his face look far less presentable. For one brief moment, he reminded me of the boy he used to be, the one who was so afraid of storms that he would crawl into our bed. But that moment passed quickly. "Mom," Kellen stepped inside, sweeping his eyes over the cabin and frowning. "This place is smaller than I thought." "Good," I said calmly. "It's just enough for what I need." On the coffee table, the photo album was still open. Kellen caught sight of the pictures of Vernon and Sade and immediately snatched one up, staring at it as if trying to force a secret out of the paper. "Who is this woman? Why have I never seen her?" I didn't answer directly. I only said, "Someone your father cared about very much." Kellen frowned. Then he tightened his grip on the manila folder in his hand like it was a shield. "I brought the original loan documents," he said quickly. "But I'm telling you right now, I have nothing to do with Dad signing those things. Someone forged Dad's signature." I looked at him for a second. "Sit down, Kellen." I pointed to the chair across from me. "I want to start with something simpler." He sat down, his back rigid. I opened Vernon's wooden box and took out the bank statements. I placed them on the table and slid them toward Kellen. "My retirement account. These withdrawals. Can you explain them?" Kellen looked down. His face turned pale when he saw the forged signatures. "Mom, I can explain. I'm listening." Kellen lifted a hand and ran it through his hair, a familiar gesture from childhood, the one he always made right before lying. Then he spoke, his voice smaller. I was only borrowing it. I was going to pay it back." I let out a soft laugh, but it wasn't amusement. $70,000. You were going to pay back $70,000 that you took with a forged signature? I didn't steal, I borrowed. Without permission. With a forged signature. That's called stealing, Kellen. Kellen's face flushed red, half shame, half anger. "You would never have given it to me if I asked." "Correct," I replied, "because I knew you would take it to gamble." Kellen froze, like someone had grabbed his throat, and that freeze answered for him. I leaned forward. "Your father hired a private investigator, Kellen," I said slowly. "He knew about the gambling. He knew about you going to the bank in Charleston. He knew you used Dad's name, Dad's signature, to mortgage the townhouse." Kellen dropped his head, his hands clasped tightly together. After a moment, he blurted out, as if trying to salvage something, "I'm sick, Mom. Gambling addiction is a real illness." "I know," I said, "but illness doesn't give you the right to steal from your family. Illness is something that needs treatment, not an excuse to destroy everything." Kellen looked up, eyes red, as if trying to pull me back into my old role, the soft-hearted mother, and I almost wavered. But then I remembered Vernon's words. "He will cry. He will apologize. Don't let him steer you back." I kept my voice firm. "Tell me about the loan." Kellen swallowed hard, then mumbled, I needed money. The people I owe, they're not waiting anymore. They said if I don't pay, they'll hurt me. I looked straight into his eyes. So, you chose to hurt your father and your mother first? Kellen said something that made me go cold. Dad was dying anyway. I stood still. My heart felt like it dropped to the bottom of me. You knew the cancer came back, I said, each word like a blade. You knew, and you still did it. Kellen avoided my gaze, his voice scrambling. I thought I could pay it back. The townhouse was worth a lot. I was going to sell it, pay everything off, but the townhouse isn't worth what you calculated, I cut in. Kellen's face collapsed, like it had been crushed. The market crashed. And then there's the environmental issue. Now it's only around $400,000. I did the math quickly in my head. So you're short almost $500,000. Not counting interest. Kellen nodded, his voice hoarse. They charge very high interest. I can't move fast enough. Then he lifted his head, clinging to a last ray of hope. Mom, we can work together. You can mortgage the house in Raleigh again. I inherited it. I stared at him, unable to believe it. The house you threw me out of? I asked. Mom, please. He was practically begging. This is life or death. I was silent for a few seconds. Then I reached into the wooden box and pulled out Vernon's final letter, the one I had saved for this exact moment. Your father has a few thoughts, I said. Do you want to hear them? Kellen nodded immediately, his face ashen. I opened the letter and began to read. I didn't rush. I read slowly, letting each sentence fall like hammer blows. And the strange thing was, the more I read, the more I felt as if Vernon was standing right behind me, not to threaten Kellen, but to keep me from softening. There are moments, as a mother, when all you need is a light touch on your shoulder, a reminder, don't save him in the way that destroyed you. And this letter was that reminder. My beloved Renita, by now Kellen will be desperate. The loan is overdue. The townhouse can't save him. And he will come to you begging for help, promising to change. Don't believe him. Kellen jerked hard, as if I had slapped him across the face. I looked up. Your father wrote that 2 weeks before he died. I turned to the next page, my voice still steady. Dad also wrote clearly, Kellen didn't only take $70,000. You took small amounts here and there for more than 2 years. In total, more than $130,000. That's not true, Kellen whispered. I pulled out another stack of papers and spread them across the table. Your father marked every transaction, Sasami, I said. 137,426. Kellen stared at the documents like he was staring at a sentence. I read the section that made the whole room turn cold. And this is what hurt your father the most. He heard you talking in the hospital parking lot. I raised my eyes to Kellen. You said, that old woman is going to die eventually, then I'll have everything. Kellen's face went white. I didn't say that. I didn't scream. I only said slowly, you said it after your father's chemotherapy appointment. He heard every word. The room was so silent I could hear the waves outside and Kellen's ragged breathing. I set the letter down. Your father spent the final weeks of his life making sure you couldn't destroy this family, I said. He saved your life, but he did not reward your sins. Kellen trembled. Mom, what do you mean? I turned my head toward the bedroom door. Sadie, I called, my voice clear. Can you come out here? The bedroom door opened, and Sade came out on her crutches. Kellen looked at her, his confusion growing as if he had just seen a puzzle piece that didn't belong in the picture in front of him. I said, my voice calm to a chilling degree, Kellen, meet your sister. The shock on Kellen's face almost froze in place. He stared at me, then at Sai, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. That can't be, he finally blurted out. Dad never had another child. Sade sat down carefully beside me. Her voice was gentle, but every word was firm as a nail driven in. Yes, Dad had me when he was 18. He gave me up for adoption because his family threatened to cut him off if he kept me. Kellen shook his head violently. Dad would have told me. Your father kept a lot of secrets, I cut in. The way you hid things from us. Kellen's eyes darted around the cabin. The truth began to drop, piece by piece. So, this cabin belongs to her? It's mine, Sade said. And now it's both of ours. Dad left it jointly. Kellen swallowed hard, clinging to the only thing he had ever been sure of. But it's worthless. Mom said it was. Sade and I looked at each other. This was the moment Vernon had set up. I spoke slowly. The cabin isn't worthless, Kellen, and your father also underestimated one thing. Kellen lifted his head. Not $2.7 million like your father wrote. The state raised the price last week, I said plainly. This property is now worth $3.4 million. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kellen repeated the number like someone who had misheard. 3.4 million? Not the cabin, Sade corrected gently. The entire parcel of land. The state is buying it back to build a marine research facility. The cabin will be demolished. I watched my son's face as the impact sank in. In his eyes, a flicker of hope sparked, then was immediately replaced by calculation. I could almost see him dividing the money in his head. So, split 3 ways? He asked quickly. Each of us still gets over $1 million. No. I stopped him immediately. Not split 3 ways. Kellen's face fell. But I'm family too. I know, I said. And precisely because you are family, your father prepared an escape route, but not the way you want. I opened Vernon's wooden box, took out a thick set of legal documents, and placed it in front of Kellen. This is the final gift your father left for you. Kellen read. His expression went through layers, confusion, then something like relief, then panic. Dad paid my debt? He whispered. Not exactly, I replied. Dad arranged for your debt to be paid, but the money doesn't go through your hands. Sade added, her voice calm as if reading a sealed conclusion. He liquidated a life insurance policy, some private assets, and investments separated from your mother's joint accounts. He arranged exactly $1.1 million. Enough to pay it all. Kellen breathed hard. Yes, I said, but that money goes into a trust fund managed by the attorney. The debt is paid directly to the creditors. You won't touch a cent. Kellen looked up, his voice cracking. Then what about my share from the property sale? I held his gaze. You have no share. Kellen seemed to lose his breath. Sade receives $2 million to guarantee lifelong medical care, I continued. I receive $1.4 million. And I get nothing? Sade looked at Kellen, not cruelly, only truthfully. You get your life. If Dad hadn't intervened, Apex Financial would not have left you alone. Dad saved you, Kellen. Kellen collapsed forward, both hands gripping his head. For a long time, there was only the sound of waves and wind outside. Then I said, gentle but final, one more thing. Kellen lifted his head, fragile hope returning. Your father enrolled you in an inpatient gambling rehabilitation program in Colorado, one of the best. Next Monday, they'll come pick you up. Sade continued. If you complete the program and stay clean, the trust will provide a small monthly stipend, enough to live modestly, not enough to relapse. For how long? Kellen asked, his voice hoarse. As long as you stay clean, I answered. The moment you place another bet, everything stops permanently. Kellen stared out the window for a long time. What if I refuse? Then the debt won't be paid, I said, and you face Apex Financial yourself. Your choice. He turned to me, and for the first time I saw the arrogance truly crack. Tears ran down his face. I hurt Dad so much, didn't I? Sade nodded, eyes red. Dad cried in the final weeks. Not because of the cancer, but because his heart broke. I spoke slowly, as if speaking to the boy from long ago rather than the man in front of me. Dad never stopped loving you, but Dad had to stop allowing you to destroy everything. Kellen broke down, sobbing, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry." I didn't hug him. I stayed still, because he needed to hit bottom for real. "I hear your apology," I said, "but forgiveness doesn't come from words. It comes from actions." Kellen took a deep breath, trying to straighten up. "The program, I'll go." That night, before leaving the cabin, Kellen stood at the door, his voice smaller. "Mom, can I call you someday if I make it?" I looked at Saad. She nodded. "If you complete the program and stay clean," I said. "Yes, but this is your last chance. I won't save you again." Kellen nodded, eyes still red, and walked out into the darkness. The state had bought back the property and gave us 60 days to move out. Sade found a suitable home, accessible, close to her doctors. I bought a small place a few blocks away, enough to start a new life without constantly being on edge. Kellen stayed in treatment. I received weekly reports. Progress was slow, but real. For the first time in years, he was working, even if only as a kitchen assistant at the facility. Sade began studying online for a degree, aiming towards social work. She wanted to help people who had once been as alone as she was, inside a cold medical and financial system. And me, I was learning how to be happy again, learning how to breathe without carrying the weight of a fear named Kellen. One afternoon, the treatment center called. "Mrs. Cross," the doctor said, "Kellen has just completed phase 2. He's asking permission to call you." I looked out over the bay, thinking about Vernon and the final gift he left behind. "Put him through," Kellen's voice came on. Completely different now, softer, slower. "Hi, Mom. Hi, son. I want to say thank you. I know I don't deserve it." "Your father is the one you should thank," I replied. Kellen was quiet for a moment, then said, his voice thick, "I think about Dad every day. I wasted everything." I didn't rush to answer. I let him keep talking, let him see his own truth. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, short, but it was the most real conversation between my son and me in years. When I hung up, for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Sade and I stood in front of the treatment facility doors in Colorado. The wind was cold, the sky gray. My heart beat slowly but heavy. Sade asked softly, "Do you think he's really changing?" I looked at the door. "I think so. At least, he's trying." The door opened. Kellen walked out. He was thinner, older, but his eyes were no longer wild. He stopped when he saw us, then walked toward us, slowly. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Sade." We stood still for a beat, 3 people who had been torn apart by lies, selfishness, and secrets, now learning how to stand beside one another. "I'm sorry," Kellen said, looking at both of us. "This time, I understand what sorry means." Sade nodded. "Thank you for doing the work to change." I looked at my son, the child I gave birth to, loved, hurt for, and I thought of Vernon. Then I hugged him. "Welcome home, my son." On the drive out of Colorado, I thought about Vernon's last letter, the one lying at the bottom of the wooden box. He apologized for the secrets, but he did what he believed was best to protect the people he loved, loving Kellen enough to let him face consequences. Loving Sadi as the daughter he never got to raise, and loving me enough to build a peaceful life I deserved. I didn't have the family I thought I had, but I had the family I needed, and for the first time in so many years, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. If you want to hear more family stories that break apart before they heal, like this one, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode, and remember to comment the city you're watching from so I know how far my story has traveled.